while the divisions of the 11th Army were in the Crimea, resting from the hardships they had endured, and I spent my vacation in Romania. The headquarters had the task of preparing the forcing of the Kerch. This was to be the beginning of the Army's participation in the already unfolding large offensive of the southern wing of the German Army. Being in Predeal, I was aware of how the preparation was going on, as I was visited by the head of the operational department of the Army Staff, Colonel Buss. Unfortunately, nothing came out of all this training but wasted paperwork. Hitler, chasing, as always, several goals at once and overestimated the initial successes of our offensive, abandoned the original plan to include the 11th Army. When I returned to the Crimea on August 12, I found here, to my regret, the new instructions of the General Command. The plan of forcing the Kerch Strait by the Army was cancelled. The execution of this operation was assigned only to the headquarters of the 42nd Corps and 42nd Division together with the Romanians. The 11th Army was intended to capture Leningrad, where the artillery operating near Sevastopol had already been sent. But unfortunately, in the future from our army broke away 3 more divisions. 50 Division had to remain in the Crimea. 22 Division, again transformed into airborne, was sent to the island of Crete, where it remained essentially inactive until the end of the war, and it was one of our best divisions. Already during the transfer, we had 72 Division taken to Army Group Center in order to eliminate a crisis situation in one area. As a result, for the fulfillment of future tasks at the disposal of the Army headquarters of the old compounds remained only the headquarters of 54 and 30 Corps, as well as 24, 132, 170 infantry, and 28 mountain divisions. Such dismemberment of the Army, in which the same Corps headquarters and divisions had been operating together under the direction of the Army headquarters for a long time, was regrettable under any circumstances, whatever the reasons that prompted the General Command to take such a step. Knowledge of each other, trust in each other, gained through hard fighting, are points which carry great weight in war and which should never be neglected. In addition to this question, another, even more important one surfaced. Was it reasonable at this point to remove the 11th Army from the southern wing of the Eastern Front in order to give it the undoubtedly less important task of capturing Leningrad? After all, in the summer of 1942, Germany was looking for a solution to its fate in the south of the Eastern Front. And for this purpose no amount of forces was superfluous. Moreover, based on the goals pursued by Hitler, it was possible to see from the very beginning that the German offensive would develop in 2 directions, to Stalingrad and the Caucasus, and that the further eastward the advancing troops advanced, the more stretched the northern flank of the striking wedge would be. So a course of events showed how much the 11th Army was needed in the future on the southern wing, regardless of whether it would be used to force the Kerch Strait to prevent the enemy's withdrawal to the Caucasus, or would act first as an operational reserve of the advancing armies. When I made a landing in Vinnitsa on my way north to discuss my new tasks in the Führer's main headquarters, I spoke at length on this subject with the Chief of the General Staff, Colonel General Galder. At the same time, Galder made it clear that Hitler's idea to seek the capture of Leningrad simultaneously with the offensive in the south contradicts his point of view. But Hitler insisted on it and will not give up his intention. True to my question whether he, Galder, considers it possible to do without the 11th Army in the south, he answered in the affirmative. I myself doubted this, but could not then refute this point of view of the Chief of the General Staff. On this visit I was horrified to note how bad relations between Hitler and his Chief of General Staff. From the report on the situation revealed that in the Army Group Center, due to the Soviet offensive in one area, created a crisis situation. When Hitler in this regard began to make attacks against the troops fighting there, the Chief of the General Staff persistently opposed him. He pointed out that the troops have long been overworked, that heavy losses in officers and non-commissioned officers cannot help but affect the condition and combat effectiveness of the army. These considerations, stated by Galder in an extremely businesslike form, had the consequence of an explosion of anger. Hitler, ever the only one that occurred in my presence. In an insensitive form, Hitler questioned the right of the Chief of the General Staff to make such judgments about his opinion. He, Hitler, can judge all this much better, since he had fought as an infantryman at the front in the First World War, while General Halder was not there. The whole scene was so undignified that I defiantly walked away from the table with the maps, and returned with the report only at Hitler's request, after he had calmed down. I felt it necessary to speak after the report with the Chief of Personnel, General Schmuntert, who was at the same time a military adjutant under Hitler. I told him that such a relationship between the Commander-in-Chief and the Chief of the General Staff of the Land Forces is completely impossible. Either Hitler must obey his Chief of General Staff and observe the necessary forms of treatment with him, or the latter must draw certain conclusions for himself. Unfortunately, nothing of the kind happened. 6 weeks later, due to a rupture between Hitler and Colonel General Holder, the latter was dismissed. August 27. The headquarters of the 11th Army arrived at the Leningrad front to hear, in the strip of the 18th Army, to find out the possibilities for a strike and to draw up a plan of attack on Leningrad. It was agreed that then the headquarters of the 11th Army would occupy a part of the front of the 18th Army, facing north, while the 18th Army remained the eastern part of the front, along the Volkhov. The northern section of the front allotted to the 11th Army consisted of a strip along the shore of the Neva from Lake Ladoga to a point southeast of Leningrad, of a strip in which the offensive was to be launched, south of Leningrad, and of a strip which covered a long stretch of land along the southern shore of the Gulf of Finland, still held by the Soviets in the vicinity of Oranienbaum. In addition to the powerful artillery to support the offensive, partly brought here from the Sevastopol area, 12 divisions including the Spanish Blue Division, 1 armoured and 1 mountain division, and an SS brigade were subordinated to the 11th Army headquarters. Of these forces, 2 divisions operated on the Nevsky front and 2 on the Oranienbaum front, so that left 9.5 divisions for the offensive on Leningrad. It is not so much forces. If we take into account the fact that the enemy in the area of Leningrad had 19 rifle divisions, 1 rifle brigade, 1 brigade of border troops and 2 tank brigades. In view of this ratio of forces, it would naturally be of considerable importance to us if the Finns, who blocked the Leningrad area from the north along the Korean Isthmus, took part in the offensive. It would have been enough if the Finns would have chained the 5.5 Soviet divisions standing against them. However, a corresponding inquiry made to the German general at the Finnish High Command, General Erfurt, showed that the Finnish High Command rejected this proposal. General Erfurt explained this Finnish point of view by the fact that Finland had always maintained since 1918 that the existence of Finland should never pose a threat to Leningrad. For these reasons, Erfurt pointed out Finnish participation in an offensive against the city was excluded. Thus, the Army headquarters, in accomplishing the task assigned to it, could count only on its own forces. We were quite clearly aware that the success of this operation was to some extent problem. The fact that this operation could not be carried out at all did not contribute to make it particularly pleasant for us. In the summer of 1941, there was certainly the possibility of capturing Leningrad in a surprise attack. The urgent seizure of this city was among the top priorities in Hitler's original plan. Whatever the reasons for this, the chances that existed at the time were not utilized. Later, Hitler hoped for a chance to force Leningrad and its population to surrender by starvation block, but the Soviets overturned his plans by organizing the supply of the city through Lake Ladoga Quay, in summer by ships, in winter by a road built on ice. There remained, besides, a front from Lake Ladoga to Oranienbaum, which absorbed much of our forces. Its elimination was highly desirable. Doubt aroused only whether the offensive was justified now that we were trying to decide the fate of the war in the south of the Eastern Front. The words "what you did not want to do in that minute will not return to you," and eternity seemed to be written over the operation against Leningrad. Meanwhile, we had to prepare in the best possible way the offensive assigned to us. During the reconnaissance of the area on the front south of Leningrad, we saw a city protected by a deeply echeloned system of field fortifications, but located, it seemed, close by. The large factory at Kolpino on the Neva River, still producing tanks, was visible. The Pulkovo shipyards on the Gulf of Finland were visible. The silhouette of St. Isaac's Cathedral and the spire of the Admiralty, as well as the Peter and Paul fortress, could be seen in the distance. In clear weather, it was possible to distinguish on the Neva also the battleship, put out of action by artillery shells. It was one of our battleships of 10,000 tons displacement, bought by the Russians in 1940. I was sad to see that the Tsar's palaces, known to me from 1931, had fallen victim to the war. The beautiful Catherine Palace in Tsarskoye Selo, as well as another smaller palace here, where the last Tsar lived, and the delightful Peterhof on the Gulf of Finland, they were burned down by Soviet artillery. Based on our observations, It became clear to us that our army should under no circumstances be drawn into fighting within the city limits of Leningrad, where our forces would quickly melt away. Hitler's view that the city could be forced to surrender by terrorist raids, specially designed for this purpose 8 Air Corps, we were as little inclined to share, as well as the experienced commander of this corps, Colonel General von Richthofen. Based on the above, the plan of the Army headquarters was to use the strongest artillery and aviation impact on the enemy to break through the 3 corps forces of his front south of Leningrad, advancing only to the southern outskirts of the city. After that, 2 corps were to turn eastward to suddenly force the Neva River southeast of the city. They had to destroy the enemy, who was between the river and Lake Ladoga, cut the supply route across Lake Ladoga, and closely encircle the city also from the east. In this case, the capture of the city could be achieved quickly and without heavy street fighting, just as it happened in its time with Warsaw. But it soon became apparent that the words quoted above were destined to be true. German military transports arriving at the Leningrad front could not, of course, escape the attention of the enemy. Already on August 27, the enemy attacked the 18th Army standing front to the east. It was necessary to put into battle just arrived 170 Division. In the following days, it became clear that the Soviet side, using large forces, organized an offensive to break the blockade of Leningrad. With this offensive, the enemy obviously wanted to preempt our offensive. On September 4 in the evening, I received a telephone call from Hitler. He stated that it was necessary my immediate intervention in the situation on the Volkhov front to avoid disaster. I was to immediately take command of this section of the front and vigorous measures to restore the situation. Indeed, on that day, the enemy in the area south of Lake Ladoga made a wide and deep breakthrough occupied by insignificant forces of the front of the 18th Army. It was, of course, not very convenient for us to take command of the threatened section of the front in the area of the 18th Army at a critical moment. Even the fact that we were entrusted with the task of organizing an offensive against Leningrad was viewed negatively in the headquarters of the 18th Army, which was quite fair. However, despite this obvious neglect, the headquarters of the 18th Army did everything possible to facilitate the fulfillment of our task by all means, especially considering that we had no rear department in the headquarters. And so instead of the planned attack on Leningrad, the battle south of Lake Ladoga unfolded. North of the road going from Leningrad through Emgar to the east, the enemy managed to capture a section of the front of the 18th Army 8 km wide and advanced about 12 km in a westerly direction to the area north of Misled. First of all, it was necessary to stop the enemy's advance with the available forces of our 11th Army. In the following days, in the course of heavy fighting, we managed to stop the enemy. After the concentration of the remaining divisions of the army arrived by this time, the headquarters could begin a decisive counter-offensive. The counter-offensive was organized from the north and south, from the strongholds of the surviving front, to cut off the enemy troops wedged right at the base of the wedge. From the south came the 30th Axe with 24, 132, 170 infantry and 3 mountain divisions. From the north came the 26th Corps with 3 divisions, which had previously occupied this section of the front, 121 infantry, 5 and 28 mountain rifle divisions. By September 21, as a result of heavy fighting, managed to encircle the enemy. In the following days were reflected strong enemy attacks from the east, aimed at unblocking the encircled enemy breakthrough army. The same fate befell the Leningrad Army, which undertook with the forces of 8 divisions a diversionary offensive across the Neva River and on the front south of Leningrad. At the same time, it was necessary to destroy the significant enemy forces in the cauldron between Misled and Go. As always, the enemy did not think of surrendering, despite the hopelessness of the situation and the fact that the continuation of the fight and from the operational point of view could not bring him benefit. On the contrary, he made more and more attempts to break out of the cauldron. Since the entire area of the cauldron was covered with dense forest, any attempt on the German side to finish off the enemy with infantry attacks would lead to huge loss of life. In this regard, the army headquarters pulled up from the Leningrad front powerful artillery, which began to conduct a continuous fire on the cauldron, supplemented by more and more air attack. Thanks to this fire, the forest area in a few days was turned into a field riddled with craters, on which only the remnants of the trunks of once proud trees giants could be seen. From the diary of the Soviet regimental commander, which we captured, we learned later what effect this fire had. From it, we also learned with what severity the commissars forced the Soviet troops in the cauldron to continue their resistance. By October 2, it was thus possible to finish the fighting in the cauldron. From the side of the enemy in this battle participated the Second Shock Army, which consisted of no less than 16 rifle divisions, 9 rifle brigades and 5 tank brigades. Of these, 1 rifle division, 6 rifle brigades and 4 tank brigades were destroyed in the cauldron. Other compounds suffered huge losses during unsuccessful attacks to unblock the encircled forces. We captured 12,000 prisoners. The enemy lost over 300 guns, 500 mortars and 244 tanks. The losses of the enemy killed many times exceeded the number of captured prisoners. If the task of restoring the situation in the eastern section of the front of the 18th Army was accomplished, still the divisions of our army suffered significant losses. At the same time, a significant part of the ammunition intended for the offensive against Leningrad was used up. Therefore, the rapid conduct of the offensive was out of the question. Meanwhile, Hitler still did not want to part with the intention to seize Leningrad. True, he was ready to limit the tasks of the offensive that, of course, would not lead to the final elimination of this front, and to this elimination in the end all came down to. On the contrary, the headquarters of the 11th Army believed that you cannot proceed to the operation against Leningrad without replenishing our forces, and in general not having enough forces. October passed for discussion of these questions and making new plans. It was not particularly pleasant to be idle here in the north, while in the south of the Eastern Front, in the Caucasus and at Stalingrad apparently, our offensive was choking. There came a moment when, and my adjutant Specht again felt dissatisfaction with himself, associated for a young officer working in a large headquarters, with the fact that this headquarters does not fulfill any decisive tasks. Tipo again began to gnaw at the bit and asked to go to the front. Realizing his eagerness, I could not bring myself to refuse him. I sent him to the 170th Division, which fought on the Neva River, and in the ranks of which he once fought in the Crimea. And the airplane Fusilier Storch, on which he flew there, crashed and Specht died. On October 25, we buried the glorious young man. For all of us, especially me, it was a heavy blow. Never again will we hear his merry laughter, his ringing voice. How I will miss this young comrade, who filled our tent with joy, who often accompanied me during difficult and dangerous trips and was always cheerful, confident and enterprising. After my chauffeur and good comrade Nigel, Specht was the second of my closest companions to fall victim to this war. Right from Specht's funeral, I had to fly to the Führer's headquarters to receive the Marshal's baton. What joy this flight would have given Specht! As always up to now, Hitler was exquisitely polite with me and gave a high assessment of the actions of the troops of the 11th Army in the Battle of Lake Ladoga. I took the opportunity to express to him my deep conviction in too high overstretch of our infantry. In view of the heavy losses inevitable when waging war against a stubborn enemy, the question of timely replenishment of infantry regiments was of crucial importance. But since the replenishment almost never arrived in time, and regiments went into battle with completely insufficient forces, inevitably the strength of the infantry dwindled with increasing speed. We learned that on Hitler's orders, the Air Force began to form 22 airfield divisions, for which the Air Force was able to allocate 170,000 people. This was not surprising. First of all, Goering in his field always acted wastefully. This applied not only to money and construction, but also to the number of soldiers. Further, the Air Force was built on the basis of large operational tasks, for the implementation of which, as it turned out, there were not enough neither flight personnel nor airplanes. Here is not the place to consider the question of why this happened. In any case, it was a fact that the Air Force was able to release 170,000 people, and they could have done it much earlier. After all, the dream of waging an operational air war had practically burst with the Battle of Britain. Now these 170,000 men were being used within the Air Force to create formations for ground combat. Considering that at one time the Air Force had wide latitude in recruiting privates, these were undoubtedly first-class soldiers. If they had been added to the divisions of the ground forces in the fall of 1941, these divisions would have remained fully operational, and the German ground forces would not have had to endure the hardships of the winter of 1941-42. But it was pure madness to create divisions of these soldiers within the Air Force. Where could these divisions get the necessary combat and general military training? Where could they get the combat experience absolutely necessary for the war in the East? Where within the Air Force could the division, regimental and battalion commanders come from. During our conversation, I detailed all these considerations to Hitler, and a little later presented them to him in a memo. He listened to my arguments, but stated that he had given these matters considerable thought and would still stick to his opinion. Some time later, the then Chief of Operations of the Army Group Center, always well informed thanks to his friendship with Hitler's adjutant, told me the following on this issue. The requirement to form their own divisions within the Air Force Göring justified before Hitler that he cannot give his soldiers, raised in the National Socialist spirit, in the land forces, which still have priests and commanded by Wilhelm officers. He told his subordinates that the Air Force must also make sacrifices, so that not only the ground forces are the kind of armed forces that alone or mainly alone make sacrifices. These were the kinds of arguments by which Göring was able to persuade Hitler to accept his plan. Otherwise, our task at Leningrad was nearing its end. During my arrival in Vinnytsia, Hitler told me that the headquarters of the 11th Army would probably be transferred to the Army Group Center in the area of Vitebsk, where there were signs of a major enemy offensive in the near future. We were to respond to the advancing enemy counter-offensive if possible. Hitler, however, told me that if he himself with his headquarters to leave Vinnytsia, I will receive command over Army Group. After Hitler removed Field Marshal List from the command of this group, Hitler himself commanded part-time this group of armors. This situation was intolerable. But even more surprising was what Hitler at this point said in connection with my possible appointment as commander of this group of armors. Next year he expects, Hitler said, to undertake by the forces of a group of mechanized armies offensive through the Caucasus to the Middle East. This is a characteristic sign of how utopian, even at that time, was his assessment of the military situation in general and operational capabilities in particular. The last days near Leningrad were marked by an event that was the heaviest blow that could befall my dear wife, myself and our children, the death of our eldest son, Hero. He died on October 29 for our beloved Germany, being a lieutenant of 51 Motorized Rifle Regiment of my old 18th Division. May I be forgiven for speaking here of my personal loss, although while under my command, many thousands of young Germans similarly gave their lives for Germany. The sacrifice made by our son was, of course, the same as the sacrifice that thousands and thousands of German youths, their fathers and mothers, had to make. But it will be understood that in these my memories there must also be a place for our son who gave his life for his fatherland. He will represent here the many others who have travelled the same path with him, who have sacrificed the same as he did, and who continue to live on in the hearts of their loved ones as our beloved boy does in our hearts. Our hero, who was born on New Year's Eve 1923 and died at the age of 19, was a weak child from birth. From early childhood he suffered from asthma, and only thanks to the tireless care of my dear wife he grew up to be a young man who was able to become a soldier. Already from childhood he had to deny himself many things because of his physical ailments, but this still led to his rapid development and a strong will to cope with the demands of life, no matter what the obstacles. Hero was a child deserving of special love, serious and thoughtful, but also cheerful, modest, always ready to help and faithful to duty. This is how he passed his way through life and fulfilled the saying uttered at his baptism. But he went his way joyfully. When he took the matriculation exam at the Knights Academy in Liegnitz in 1940, his wish was to become a soldier, namely, a soldier of the branch of the army in which I had served, a soldier of the infantry, which is called the Queen of the Fields, because it has always borne the brunt of battle. Needless to say, we, his parents, understood his desire to follow the path of his ancestors' generations, and this desire was a matter of course for him during the war, although my wife and I never tried to induce him to choose this profession. The profession of an officer, the desire to be an educator of German youth to lead them when duty called him to do so, was in his blood. Therefore, after receiving his matriculation certificate, he joined the 51 Motorized Rifle Regiment in Liegnitz and participated as an infantryman in the summer campaign of 1941 in Russia. He became a non-commissioned officer and received the Iron Cross for rescuing a comrade who was wounded during a search and had fallen behind his search party. He returned home in the fall of 1941, enrolled in military school and became an officer in the spring of 1942. After a serious illness and a leave of absence, he arrived again to his favorite regiment, fighting as part of the 16th Army south of Lake Ilmen. I had the joy of seeing him when he briefly visited me in my command car during the battle at Lake Ladoga. I saw him again after that when I visited my friend Colonel General Bush at 16th Army Headquarters on October 18. He invited Hero to the evening, and we had fun with Bush and my favourite adjutant Specht, who died a few days later. On the morning of October 30, 1942, my faithful Chief of Staff, General Schultz, Wheeler's successor, informed me after the morning report that my son Hero had been killed the previous night by a Russian aerial bomb. Being an errand officer in his battalion, he was on his way to the front line at that moment to relay orders to one platoon commander. So on October 31, we buried my dear son on the shore of Lake Ilmen. The divisional chaplain of the 18th Motorized Rifle Division, Kruger, quite in the spirit of our son, began his eulogy with the following words. After the burial, I flew home for a few days to my dear wife, who especially loved this son of ours and cared most of all for him, who gave us only joy, though interspersed sometimes with worries because of his infirmities, which he courageously bore. We placed his soul in God's hands. The hero Erich Sylvester von Manstein, like many, many young Germans, died in the face of the enemy as a brave soldier. The profession of an officer was his calling. He passed his life, though young, but with a marvelous maturity of outlook. If we can speak of a noble young man in the true sense of the word, he was just such a man, not only in his appearance, tall, slender, delicately built, with an oblong, noble face, but above all in his character and conviction. There was nothing false about this young man. Modest, loving, always ready to help, serious in his views, but at the same time cheerful. He had no ambition, but only a sense of comradeship, and more than that, a sense of love for people. His thoughts and soul were open to all that was good and beautiful. He was the descendant of many generations of soldiers, but it was because he was an inspired German soldier that he was a noble man in the true sense of the word, a man and a Christian. While I was in Liegnitz after Hero's funeral, the headquarters of the 11th Army was transferred from the Leningrad area to Army Group Center in the Vitebsk area. During the few weeks of stay in this area, no significant events worthy of mention took place. Before, there was a real possibility of using the headquarters of the 11th Army against the expected Russian offensive. Events in the south of the Eastern Front entailed the need to use it in a new place and for new tasks. On November 20, the Army headquarters received an order that we, as the headquarters of the newly created Army Group Don, should assume command of the section of the front on both sides of Stalingrad. I was at this time with the head of the Operations Department, Colonel Bussey, was on the front section of the Corps von der Chevalerie, and was delayed there because the railroad bed was blown up by partisans. Because of partisan activity in the area, it was possible to travel either in armoured cars or in specially guarded trains. The weather was bad, so we left Vitebsk by rail on November 21 and were again delayed because the road was damaged by a mine explosion. On November 24, on my birthday, we arrived at the headquarters of Army Group B, which occupied our future section of the front. What we learned here about the situation of the 6th Army and the situation on the adjoining fronts of the 4th Tank Army and the 3rd and 4th Romanian armies will be described in the chapter The Stalingrad Tragedy. With the appointment as commander of Army Group Don, I was for the first time in direct subordination to Hitler as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces and Ground Forces. Only now I had the opportunity to truly know and appreciate how he tried to fulfill the task of a military commander along with the management of the state. Until then, I had only observed his influence on the management of the troops from afar, not directly, due to the climate of strict secrecy in all operational matters. I could not form my own informed opinion of Hitler. During the Polish campaign, we remained unknown cases of Hitler's interference in the leadership of the Land Army. During his twice visit to the Rundstedt Army Group, he listened carefully to our report on the situation and the intentions of the Army Group headquarters, agreeing with our considerations without any objection. About the plan for the occupation of Norway was not known to any outsider at all. Hitler's position on the question of an offensive in the West had already been detailed. Of course, it was regrettable that in this matter he did not at all consider the OK. In any case, it must be recognized that his concept of active offensive action in the West was militarily correct in principle, although not in relation to the initial time frame he outlined. Certainly, the operational plan of the offensive, conducted under his orders, was in its basic outlines drawn up by him. However, as already indicated above, this plan could hardly lead to decisive success. Apparently, at first he himself did not believe in the possibility of achieving success to the extent that it was then actually achieved. However, when the headquarters of Army Group presented him with an operational plan outlining such possibilities, Hitler immediately grasped it. He made it his own plan, however, with certain reservations in which the fear of risk. His cardinal mistake, the order to stop the tank formations before Dunkirk, was not at that time obvious to the uninitiated, because it was almost nothing known. We were misled by the spectacle of military equipment left by the enemy in huge numbers on the coast of Dunkirk. We did not yet know that the British had essentially completely saved their army. The absence of a war plan that would have allowed timely preparations for the invasion clearly indicated the fiasco of the command of the armed forces, i.e., Hitler. On the other hand, it was impossible for an outsider to judge whether the decision to move against the Soviet Union was politically inevitable. In any case, the concentration of Soviet forces on our borders, as well as on the Hungarian and Romanian borders, was threatening. I, as a corps commander and then commander of the 11th Army, knew as little about Hitler's influence on the development of the plan of operations against the Soviet Union, as well as on the conduct of operations in the first period of the campaign, as well as on the plans for the summer offensive of 1942. In any case, Hitler did not interfere in the management of the campaign in the Crimea. Moreover, at the time of my report in the spring of 1942, he agreed unreservedly with our plans, and he did, no doubt, everything possible to ensure success at Sevastopol. It has already been stated here that I considered the subsequent use of the 11th Army to be a mistake. Only now, being as commander of a group of armies in direct subordination to Hitler, I could truly recognize him in the role of supreme commander. As a military leader, Hitler cannot, of course, be discounted with the favorite expression, a World War I combat officer. Undoubtedly, he possessed a certain ability to analyze operational possibilities, which was already evident when he approved the plan of operations on the Western Front proposed by Army Group. Such abilities are also not uncommon in dilettantes in military matters. Otherwise, military history would have nothing to report about a number of princes as gifted military leaders. But in addition to this, Hitler possessed great knowledge and an amazing memory, as well as a creative imagination in the field of technology and all problems of armament. His knowledge of the use of new weapons in our army and double was even more amazing. In the army of the enemy, as well as digital data regarding the production of weapons in his country and in the enemy countries were amazing. This he used willingly when he wanted to divert the conversation from a subject he disliked. There is no doubt that he, with his knowledge and his extraordinary energy, contributed to the accelerated development of many branches of armaments, but his belief in his superiority in these matters had fatal consequences. By his interference, he hindered the steady development of the Air Force and its timely improvement. Undoubtedly, he slowed down the development and in the production of jet engines and atomic weapons. In addition, his interest in all technical issues led him to overestimate the technical means. Thus, he thought it possible, with the help of several divisions of assault guns or new tanks Tiger, to restore the situation in areas where success could only be achieved by using large formations. Generally speaking, it was his experience-based military knowledge that he lacked, which, unfortunately, could not be replaced by his intuition. If, as has already been said, Hitler had a certain understanding of operational possibilities or quickly assimilated them when they were presented to him by someone else, but still he was not able to judge the prerequisites and possibilities for the implementation of an operational. He lacked an understanding of the relationship between any operational task and its spatial factors, on the one hand, and manpower and time requirements on the other, not to mention their dependence on logistical capabilities. He did not realize or did not want to realize that, for example, every major offensive operation, in addition to the forces required for the first offensive battle, needs constant replenishment with new forces. This was especially sharply revealed during the preparation and conduct of the summer offensive of 1942. Here we must include a fantastic plan for an offensive through the Caucasus to the Middle East and even India, which he wanted to implement the next year by the motorized group of troops. Both in the political field, at least after his successes in 1938, and in the military field, Hitler lacked a sense of proportion to determine what could and could not be achieved. In the fall of 1939, he saw no possibility of decisive success for a properly organized German offensive on the Western Front, despite his disparaging assessment of France's ability to resist. When that success was achieved, however, he lost the ability to assess his capabilities correctly under different conditions. In both cases, he lacked strategic and operational literacy. With a vivid imagination, he grasped at every tempting target, and the result was that he split German forces between several targets at once or between different theatres of operations. He never really understood the rule that in the decisive direction in no case should not be spared forces, that if necessary should be sacrificed secondary fronts or take a certain risk by decisively weakening them. Thus, during the summer offensive of 1942 and 1943, he could not dare to put everything at stake to achieve success. At the same time, he was not able or unwilling to provide for the necessary measures in case it is necessary to change the unfavourable development of events. As for Hitler's operational objectives, at least in the war with the Soviet Union, they were largely determined by political and military economic considerations. This has already been mentioned in passing in the introductory remarks to the campaign in Russia, and will be discussed further when describing the defensive battles of 1943-1944. Undoubtedly political, and now, above all, military economic issues play an essential role in determining the strategic goal of the war. But Hitler did not take into account the following circumstance. The capture and especially the retention of territory must have the prerequisite of victory over the enemy's armed forces. Until this military factor is not achieved, the occupation of militarily and economically valuable areas, that is, the achievement of the territorial goal of the war, remains doubtful, and their long-term retention. This is clearly demonstrated by the war with the Soviet Union. It was not possible then, as it is now, with the help of aviation and various long-range weapons, to destroy the enemy's military industry and communications network, to such an extent that his armed forces were unable to continue the struggle. However true it may be that strategy must be the handmaiden of political leadership, nevertheless, the latter cannot to such an extent neglect the strategic goal of any war, the destruction of the enemy's army, as was the case in Hitler's definition of the operational objectives of the war. Only victory opens the way to the attainment of political and economic objectives. Now I come to the decisive factor that formed Hitler's basis for leadership, the overestimation of the power of the influence of the will, his will, which supposedly was enough to translate into conviction, even in the youngest infantryman, to confirm the correctness of his decisions, to ensure the success of the implementation of his orders. The strong will of the commander is, of course, one of the essential conditions of victory. Sometimes a battle is lost. Success is lost only because the commander's will was paralyzed at a decisive moment. But the commander's will to win, helping him to withstand and in difficult, critical moments, is not like Hitler's will, which stemmed from his belief in his mission. Such faith inevitably leads to the groundless assertion of one's views, as well as to the belief that one's own will can transcend the limits placed in its way by harsh reality, be they limits consisting in the multiple superiority of the enemy's forces, in the conditions of place and time, or simply in the fact that, after all, the enemy has a will. Convinced that his will would ultimately prevail, Hitler was, in general, little inclined to take into account the presumed intentions of the enemy command. Just as little was he willing to accept even the most reliable data, say, of the enemy's multiple superiority. He rejected them, or downplayed them, claiming that the enemy's formations and units were ill-prepared, or resorted to his favorite trick, listing figures relating to data on the German military industry. Thus, the factor of the Führer's will excluded to some extent such essential elements as the assessment of the situation from which the decision of any commander must be derived. But in so doing, Hitler left the ground of actual reality. Strange, however, was the fact that this overestimation of the importance of his own will, this disregard for the possible intentions and forces of the enemy, combined with the lack of the necessary courage in making a decision. After the success Hitler had achieved by 1938 in the political arena, he had become a gambler in matters of politics, but in the military field he was afraid of any risk. Only the decision to occupy Norway could be considered a bold military decision by Hitler, although even in this matter the initiative came from Grand Admiral Raeder. But even here, as soon as the critical situation at Narvik, Hitler was ready to give the order to abandon the city, and thereby sacrifice the main goal of the entire operation, to ensure the export of ore. When conducting an offensive in the West, also manifested Hitler's fear of taking military risks, as discussed above. Hitler's decision to attack the Soviet Union was, after all, an inevitable consequence of the refusal to invade England, the risk of which again seemed to Hitler too great. During the campaign against Russia, the fear of risk manifested itself in two forms. First, as will be described below, in the rejection of all maneuver in the conduct of operations, which in the conditions of war, starting in 1944, could be provided only by voluntary, albeit temporary, abandonment of the captured areas. Secondly, in the fear of denuding secondary sections of the front or theatres of war in the interests of a section which was becoming decisive, even if the situation in that section was clearly threatened. This desire to avoid risk in military matters was apparently due to the following three reasons. First, Hitler's subconscious feeling that he did not possess the military talent to overcome a crisis involving such a risk if necessary, something in which he could not rely on himself, he could even less entrust to his generals. Second, the anxiety inherent in every dictator as to whether mistakes discovered would not undermine his prestige. Third, the reluctance, rooted in his imperiousness, to give up what he had once mastered. In connection with the above should be mentioned about another property of Hitler's character, against which were unsuccessfully fought as the chief of his general staff, Colonel General Zitzler, and I during my time as commander of the army group. Hitler liked, as long as possible, to delay any decision which he was unpleasant, but without which he still could not do without. This happened whenever it was necessary, timely throwing into battle their forces, to prevent the planned in connection with the situation of combat success of the enemy, or not to give the enemy the opportunity to use the available success. Chief of General Staff had to fight with Hitler all day long when it came to releasing forces from the less threatened, at the moment the sections of the front for those areas where the critical situation. Usually he gave too little force and too late, so that he subsequently had to give them several times more than it would have taken to restore the situation if he had immediately provided the number of forces requested at first. But it took weeks of fighting to get him to decide to abandon a position that was almost impossible to hold. The same thing happened if it came to the question of, in order to free up forces to clear the not operationally important outstanding forward areas on the front, which at the moment no one threatened. Apparently, Hitler always believed that events will still develop at his will, and that he can avoid making decisions that were unpleasant to him, because it meant recognizing the fact that he had to reckon with the will of the enemy. At the same time, he was afraid to risk withdrawing forces from those parts of the front which might be weakened. Demonstration of the importance of his own will, the known fear of risk in the case of maneuver warfare, as well as Hitler's unwillingness to voluntarily give up anything. All this over time became increasingly characteristic of his military leadership. The stubborn defense of every inch of ground gradually became the sole principle of his leadership. Thus, after the brilliant successes achieved by the German armed forces in the early years of the war through maneuver operations, Hitler, when the first crisis at Moscow came, adopted from Stalin's recipe for stubbornly holding any position. This recipe brought the Soviet command to the brink of ruin in 1941, and it was abandoned during the German offensive of 1942. But when the Soviet counter-offensive was finally halted in the winter of 1941, thanks to the resistance of our troops, Hitler was convinced that only his order, not to allow withdrawal without authorization, had saved the German army from the fate that had befallen Napoleon's army in 1812. True, this conviction was reinforced in him by people from his inner circle, as well as some front command. When then, in the fall of 1942, the German offensive at Stalingrad and in the Caucasus stopped, and again created a critical situation, Hitler thought that in the stubborn resistance at any cost, he found the key to success, and in the future he in general could not be persuaded and forced to abandon this view. It is generally recognized that positional defense represents the strongest form of combat. But this is true if it can be organized so effectively that the enemy bleeds to death while attacking the positions of the defender. But this was out of the question in the East. The number of available German divisions was never enough to organize a positional defense of such strength. Many times superior to us, the enemy has always had the opportunity through the massive use of their forces to achieve at any point to break through our two stretched fronts. As a result, significant German forces were unable to avoid encirclement. Only by the conduct of maneuver fighting could the superiority of the German command and German troops be realized, and thus possibly achieved. In the end, the weakening of the Soviet Union's forces. The consequences of the influence of the principle of hold at all costs, on which Hitler insisted more and more strongly, I will discuss in more detail below, when characterizing the defensive battles in the East in 1943-1944. The fact that Hitler insisted more and more strongly on this principle was very closely connected with his character. He was a man who knew only violent struggle to the last limit. His way of thinking is more consistent with the picture of bleeding in front of our lines of the enemy than the picture of an elegant swordsman who knows how to also retreat, so that the more confident to then strike a decisive blow. To the notion of military art he opposed, after all, the notion of brute power, a power whose greatest power of influence is guaranteed, according to Hitler, by the strength of will on which that power rests. If, therefore, Hitler placed the strength of power over the strength of spirit, valued the bravery of the soldier, but not to the same extent his skill, it is not surprising that he fell into the error of overvaluing technical means as well as the rage du nombre. He intoxicated himself with the numerical figures of the German war industry, which had moved forward largely because of him. He did not notice how much skill and training was needed to use new weapons with the greatest efficiency. For him, it was enough if new weapons arrived at the front, regardless of whether the units equipped with them know how to use them, and whether the weapon was tested in combat conditions. In the same spirit were formed on Hitler's orders more and more new divisions. An increase in the number of our large formations was undoubtedly desirable. However, their formation went at the expense of replenishing existing divisions. The latter were bleeding, and new formations, due to their lack of combat experience, also had to initially pay for this excessive bloodshed. The formation of the airfield divisions mentioned above, the new SS divisions and the so-called People's Grenadier divisions are prime examples. Finally, it should also be noted that although Hitler constantly emphasized that he thought like a soldier and willingly talked about the military experience he gained at the front, in reality he was far from the thoughts and feelings of a soldier. Similarly, and the way of action of his party had nothing to do with the Prussian spirit, although it liked to emphasize it. Of course, Hitler was absolutely accurately informed of the situation at the front through reports of the commanders of army groups, army commanders, etc. Often he also listened directly to the oral reports of frontline officers. Thus he knew not only about the actions of our troops, but also about what they had to endure as a result of prolonged overstretch since the beginning of the campaign against the Soviet Union. Perhaps this was one of the reasons for Hitler's reluctance to come to the front. It was quite difficult to persuade him to visit the headquarters of our army group, not to mention that it never occurred to him to continue his trip even closer to the front. Perhaps he was afraid that such trips would destroy the dream he nurtured about the irresistibility of his will. No matter how Hitler tried at every opportunity to emphasize his qualities as a former frontline soldier, I never got the feeling that the fate of the army deeply touched him. Losses were for him only figures, indicating a decrease in combat effectiveness. As a man, they hardly touched him seriously. True, in Monitor Hitler thought, as befits a soldier, in the question of military awards. These awards he wanted to recognize, first of all, real fighters, brave men. Thus, issued by him at the beginning of the campaign, the provision on awarding the Iron Cross can be considered exemplary. This order could be awarded only for bravery, shown in battle, and for actual merit in the management of troops, that is, in respect of the latter. Only large army chiefs and their closest assistants. Unfortunately, this clear and undoubtedly correct provision on the part of some awarding authorities was violated already at the beginning of the war. True, this was partly due to the belated establishment of the War Merit Cross, intended for those who, because of their service use, could not fulfill the conditions entitling them to the Iron Cross, although they deserved the award. Hitler always had a harder time getting the Knight's Cross for a general than for an officer or private from the front lines. Those who later laughed at all the various insignia introduced by Hitler during the war would have to imagine the marvels our soldiers performed during that long war. In any case, such signs as, for example, a sign for participation in hand-to-hand combat or issued to the soldiers of the 11th Army Crimean Shield. The soldiers wore with pride. However, as shown by the facts of awarding soldiers of the enemy side numerous orders, the issue of military awards cannot be brushed aside, resorting to the unwise expression bling. The above-described shortcomings significantly reduced the opportunities that would have given Hitler a reason to successfully play his own chosen role of supreme commander. These shortcomings could have been compensated for if he had been willing to resort to the advice of the experienced chief of the General Staff, who shared responsibility with him, or if he had overcome a sense of distrust of the latter. After all, Hitler had some important qualities for the role of commander: strong will, nerves, withstanding in the most difficult critical moments, Undoubtedly a sharp mind and, as already mentioned, with known abilities in the field of operational art, also and the ability to analyze the technical possibility. If he had been able to supplement his lack of training and experience in the military field with the knowledge and skill of the chief of his general staff, then, despite the above-mentioned shortcomings, we could still have a quite satisfactory military leadership. But this was precisely what Hitler was not willing to do. Just as he regarded the strength of his will in any respect as the decisive factor, his political successes, as well as the military victories of the First War years, which he attributed to himself, entailed that Hitler increasingly lost his sense of proportion in assessing his own abilities. To accept the proposals of the Chief of the General Staff, who shared responsibility with him, would mean for him not to supplement his own will, but to bend his will to the will of others. Added to this was the fact that because of his origin and development, he harbored an insurmountable distrust of military leaders. For him, the way to their thoughts and feelings was closed because they came from a different environment. Therefore, he did not want to have a truly responsible military advisor by his side. He wanted to resemble Napoleon, who tolerated only assistants and executors of his will. But he had neither the military knowledge nor the military genius that Napoleon possessed. In describing the plan for the invasion of England, I have already said that Hitler so organized the supreme military leadership that there was no such body that could advise him on the conduct of the war as a whole, and that would be able to draw up a plan of warfare. The headquarters for the operational direction of the armed forces, which in theory was intended to fulfill such a task, played in practice only the role of a military secretariat. It existed to translate Hitler's thoughts and orders into the language of military orders. But in the future, the situation deteriorated further by referring the Norwegian theatre of military operations to the competence of the OK and completely excluding the participation of the OK in the leadership of this theatre. Hitler took the first step towards the fragmentation of the leadership of military operations also on land. Subsequently, all other theatres of war were gradually transferred to the jurisdiction of the OKL. Oak remained, in the end, responsible only for the Eastern Theatre of Operations, headed by Hitler himself. The Chief of the General Staff of the Land Forces was thereby removed from all interference in the fighting in other theatres of war, just as the commanders of the other two branches of the armed forces were removed from participation in deciding the conduct of the war as a whole. The former had not the slightest influence on the distribution of ground army forces among the various theatres of war, and often did not even have sufficient information about the manpower and equipment received by one theatre or another. Under such circumstances, there were inevitable disagreements between the headquarters of the operational leadership of the armed forces and the general staff of the land forces, and one of Hitler's principles, and was to create such differences so that in all matters his voice was decisive. Such an unsuccessful organization of the top military leadership should naturally lead to the fact that it failed in its tasks. Demonstration of the strength of his will and his skill had, further, the consequence that Hitler increasingly tried to interfere in the leadership of lower commanders by issuing individual orders. The strength of the German military command had long been that it relied on a sense of responsibility, on the independence and initiative of commanders of all ranks, and developed these qualities wherever possible. Therefore, the instructions within the higher military authorities and the orders in the middle and lower ranks mainly contained a task for the subordinate formations, units and subdivisions. The specific fulfillment of these tasks was the business of the unit commanders. To this character of management, the German land army owes much of the success it achieved over its opponents, in whose armies orders usually determine the actions of unit commanders to individual details. In ours, however, this kind of interference in the functions of the subordinate chain of command took place only when, in the interests of the case without it, could not be done. On the contrary, Hitler believed that he, from behind his desk, everything is seen much better than the commanders at the front, although it was clear that much of his operational map is already outdated. Needless to say, he could not determine from afar what was the right and necessary action on the ground. It became increasingly his habit to interfere in the management of groups of armies, etc., by issuing individual orders, which was not at all part of his duties. Although I had not myself until then encountered such cases of interference in our functions, I nevertheless got an idea of it from the accounts of Field Marshal von Kluge, whom I met at a station on my way from Vitebsk to Rostov. He said that in the area of operations of Army Group Center he was obliged to inquire of Hitler concerning any actions of units and units of a battalion's strength and above. If later I did not have to observe such cases of Hitler's inadmissible interference in the management of our army group, we still had enough reasons for conflicts with the High Command due to Hitler's interference. The tendency to give individual orders, as a rule, only hindered and harmed the management, was not matched by his passivity when it came to forward guidance of an operational nature. The more he regarded the principle of hold at all costs as the alpha and omega of his art of command, the less inclined he was to give instructions for the long term that would take into account the anticipated development of the operational situation. He was unwilling to recognize that under this method of command, he would eventually have the will of the enemy imposed upon him. His suspicion prevented him, by giving instructions with an eye to the long term, from thereby giving his subordinate commanders a freedom of action which they might have used differently from what his imagination had pictured. In so doing, he was, in one way or another, depriving the art of driving troops of its real basis. Toward the end, even the Army Group headquarters could not do without the instructions of the General Command, at least in those cases where the Army Group acted as part of the whole front, that is, also in cooperation with its neighbors. We often wistfully recalled the time when we in the Crimea could fight in a kind of our own theatre of war. It remains to tell how the disputes between Hitler and the major military commanders, inevitable with the views that Hitler held on matters of military leadership. In some descriptions of such discussions before us appears furious Hitler with foam on his lips, and on occasion and sinking his teeth into the carpet. That he had explosions of rage when he lost all self-control is certainly true. But I personally observed as a listener only the one incident already mentioned above between Hitler and Colonel General Halder, during which Hitler shouted and was insensitive. Also, his treatment of Keitel was not in keeping with the latter's position, but quite obviously, Hitler had an unmistakable sense of how far he could go in a conversation with this or that interlocutor, and at what point, with the help of a burst of anger. Perhaps often deliberate, contrived, he could count on the fact that his intimidation will succeed. As for my personal experience with Hitler, I must say that he always kept to form and stayed on business, even when our views were opposite or mutually exclusive. When one single time he made a remark in my address which was not business but personal, he silently accepted my rather sharp retort. Hitler masterfully possessed the ability to psychologically adjust to the character of the interlocutor whom he wanted to convince of something. In addition, of course, he always knew on what occasion or with what intention to appear to him for a report. He could therefore prepare all his counter-arguments in advance. He had an exceptional ability to convey to others his own confidence, true or feigned, especially when officers arrived from the front who did not know him intimately. On such occasions one could observe how a man who had entered to tell Hitler about the critical situation at the front would return from it having gained confidence. During the occasional disputes that I, as commander of the Army Group, had to have with him on operational matters, a great impression was made by the sheer, incredible tenacity with which he fought for his point of view. It almost always took many hours of struggle to get what he wanted from him, or to get away with comforting promises and sometimes with nothing. I have not met any other person who could show even approximately the same stamina and persistence in such discussions. If such discussions between Hitler and the front commander lasted at most a few hours, the chief of the General Staff, General Zeitzler, often had to fight for many days in a row during each evening's situation report to get something absolutely necessary from Hitler. On such occasions, we always asked him on which round he had won the fight. At the same time, Hitler's arguments, including purely military, with which he defended his point of view, as a rule, was not so easy to refute. After all, when considering the question of operational intentions, no one cannot predict with complete certainty the outcome of an operation. In war, generally speaking, nothing can be absolutely certain. When Hitler noticed that his point of view on the operational question did not make the proper impression, then he brought political and economic arguments and achieved his own, because these his arguments were usually unable to refute the front commander, who did not have information about the political situation and economic conditions. In the end, the only thing left was to insist that if Hitler did not approve the plans or demands contained in the report, there would be an unfavorable situation militarily, which would have an even more unfavorable impact on politics and the economy. On the other hand, Hitler sometimes showed a willingness to listen to considerations, even if he did not agree with them, and could then discuss them in a business-like manner. Any internal connection, close contact between the dictator, a fanatic who thought only of his political goals and lived in faith in his mission, and the military leaders, of course, could not be established. Stendhal apparently did not interest Hitler at all. He saw people as mere instruments to serve his political ends. No ties of friendship did not bind Hitler to the German soldiers. Increasingly revealed errors of the German military leadership, which are partly explained by the personality of Hitler, partly were a consequence of the above-described completely unsuccessful organization of the highest organs of military leadership, forced, of course, to think about the question of whether it is impossible to change the situation and how to change it. In doing so, as in this book as a whole, I do not wish to touch upon the political side of the question. I have on no less than 3 occasions tried to encourage Hitler, in the interests of sensible warfare, to change the structure of the supreme military leadership. I do not think that anyone else similarly tried to persuade him that his military leadership was unsatisfactory. That said, it was clear to me that Hitler would never agree to formally resign his supreme command. As a dictator, he could not do so without losing his prestige, which was unthinkable for him. Therefore, in my opinion, it was important to achieve that Hitler, while retaining nominally supreme, agreed to transfer the command of operations in all theatres of war, virtually in the hands of one responsible chief of the General Staff, and appoint a special commander of the Eastern Theatre of Operations. About these attempts, which unfortunately remained unsuccessful, we will talk below, when characterizing the military events of 1943-1944. For me, it was a very sensitive issue, because Hitler was well aware that many in the land forces would like to see me in the post of really vested with full authority Chief of General Staff or Commander of the entire Eastern Front. It was not my intention to dwell here on the question of a violent change in the administration of the state, and on the attempt made for this purpose on July 20, 1944. Within the framework of this description of my combat experience, it will suffice to say that as a responsible commander at the front, I did not consider it possible to raise the question of a coup d'état during the war, because, in my opinion, this would soon lead to the collapse of the front and possibly to chaos in Germany. One no longer has to speak of the oath of office, nor is it permissible to kill for political reasons. It is not possible, as a high military leader, to demand for years that soldiers give their lives for victory in order to then contribute to defeat with their own hand. By the way, it was clear even then that a coup d'état would in no way have changed the Allies' demand for Germany's unconditional surrender. I believe, however, that at the time when I was in command, we had not yet come to the conviction that such a solution was the only possible. These verses, which brought us the news of the heroism of the defenders of Thermopylae, and which have since been regarded as a song of bravery, loyalty and duty, will never be carved on a stone in Stalingrad, a city on the Volga, in memory of the victims of the 6th Army who perished there. A cross and a tombstone will never be erected over the footprints of the dead, starved and frozen German soldiers, but the memory of their inexpressible suffering and death, of their unparalleled bravery, devotion, and fidelity to duty will survive the time when the triumphant shouts of the victors have long since fallen silent, when the groans of the suffering have fallen silent, when the anger of the disappointed and hardened has been forgotten. Let this bravery be in vain. Let it be loyalty to a man who did not understand it, did not reciprocate it, and therefore did not deserve it. Let this fulfillment of duty lead to death or captivity. But still this bravery, this service to duty, remained the song of the German soldier spirit, that soldier's spirit, which today, it is true, no longer exists and which seems a relic in an age when atomic bombs capable of extinguishing all life can be sent from a safe distance, whose heroism, however, is as worthy of immortalization as the heroism to which those verses were once dedicated. A sacrifice may be in vain if it is made to a lost cause. Loyalty may be meaningless if it belonged to a regime that did not know how to appreciate it. Loyalty to duty may be a mistake if the grounds on which it rested turned out to be false. And yet there remains the ethical value of the conviction that caused the soldiers of the 6th Army to follow their sacrificial journey to the end. Describing the heroism of the German 6th Army will someday be within the reach of a real writer, but the suffering and death of German soldiers is too sacred to be sensationalized as a horror story, used as a source of dubious revelations, or as an opportunity for political controversy. The pen of one who wants to contribute to the history of this tragedy should be driven by reverence, not hatred. Someone who, like me, participated in the Battle of Stalingrad in a responsible position, even if from the outside and unable to influence it. Someone in whose chest beats the heart of a soldier. He will not desecrate with empty words the deathbed of the heroes of Stalingrad. The tragedy of this event does not correspond to a loud phrase or a false voice of hatred. The author will content himself with an objective account of what he can say from his own point of view, what he considers possible to evaluate realistically. He will leave the final judgment to history, confident that history will be fair, at least to those who, believing in their duty, have travelled this bitter path, confident also that history will condemn errors, mistakes, or omissions, but that it will consign to damnation only those who have violated the commandment of fidelity, which must be observed by him who demands its fulfillment. I do not undertake to describe the sufferings and battles of the soldiers of the Sixth Army, in which I was prevented by my official duty from participating. I will not here touch on the human side of the tragedy, the suffering, despair, or exasperation, the deaths of these men, the fear, worries, and sorrow of their loved ones in those days. But not because I, my fellow workers, as well as all those who fought then to save the Sixth Army, did not realize daily and hourly all these horrors. Apart from those who were walking that sacrificial path at Stalingrad and their dear relatives back home, no one experienced and suffered the human side of this tragedy as deeply as we, who tried to come to the aid of our comrades to the last opportunity. But the human side of this tragedy consists of such deep, almost unimaginable suffering and such great, though vain heroism that we, who have experienced all this, are in danger of losing our sense of proportion in describing it. By doing so, we would not diminish the pain of those who suffered so much, but would only open old wounds. We would do more to foment hatred than to learn from the events. I shall therefore attempt to make an impartial and objective description of the development of this tragedy. I believe that I should not speak of the greatness of the heroism and suffering of these German soldiers. I want to make an attempt to look at the fate of the Sixth Army, in accordance with my official position, from the point of view of a wider range of events, of which Stalingrad was a part, albeit the most tragic. Therefore, the reader will understand me if I take him not to the heat of battle, not to the snowy fields around Stalingrad or to the places of fighting over ravines and residential neighborhoods, but to the location of a major headquarters. He will be surrounded not by the heat of battle or the deadening cold of the steppe, but by an atmosphere of analysis and evaluation of the situation, an atmosphere of responsibility. He can be sure that even in it beat hot hearts that were with those who fought for Stalingrad. The battle for Stalingrad is understandably regarded by the Soviets as a decisive turning point in the war. The British attribute a similar significance to the outcome of the Battle of Britain, that is, the repulsion of the German air offensive in the British Isles in 1940. The Americans tend to attribute the final Allied success to their own participation in the war. Likewise, in Germany, many believe that Stalingrad has the significance of a decisive battle. In contrast, it must be stated that no single event can be attributed decisive significance. These are the consequence of a number of factors, the most important of which is probably the fact that Germany, in the end, as a result of Hitler's policy and strategy, was hopelessly weaker than its opponents. Of course, Stalingrad is insofar a turning point in the history of World War II, as the wave of the German offensive crashed on the Volga, only to roll back like a surf wave. But as heavy as the loss of the Sixth Army was, it did not mean that the war in the East, and thus the war in general, was lost. It was still possible to achieve a draw, if such a goal had been set by German policy and the command of the armed forces. The reason for the death of the Sixth Army should, of course, be sought in the fact that Hitler, mainly for reasons of prestige, refused to give the order to abandon Stalingrad. But the circumstance why the Sixth Army could be in such a situation at all has its cause operational errors made by the German High Command earlier, in the organization and conduct of the offensive in 1942, and mainly in its last phase. On the operational situation in which, as a result of these errors, was the southern wing of the German Eastern Front in the deep autumn of 1942, we will discuss below, when describing the winter campaign of 1942-43. Here, I would like to emphasize only those moments that were decisive for the fate of the Sixth Army. Due to the fact that Hitler determined the goal of the offensive in 1942, Based primarily on military and economic considerations, the offensive developed in two divergent directions, to the Caucasus and to Stalingrad. Therefore, after the cessation of the German offensive, there was a front to hold which on the German side did not have sufficient forces. And this wing of the front at the disposal of the German command did not have an operational reserve, after it scattered in different directions freed in the Crimea 11th Army. Army Group stood with a front to the south in the northern part of the Caucasus between the Black and Caspian Seas. Army Group held a front facing east and northeast, starting on the Volga south of Stalingrad, turning north of the city to the middle reaches of the Don River, and continuing along this river to the area north of Voronezh. Both groups of armies had to hold fronts of such length, for which they had too few forces, especially if we take into account the fact that the southern wing of the enemy was not really broken, and was able to avoid destruction by withdrawal of forces, although suffering significant losses. In addition, the enemy had very large operational reserves in the remaining sections of the front, as well as in the deep rear. In the end, between both German groups in the area of the Kalmyk steppes formed a gap width of 300 km, which was covered by completely insufficient forces of one division located in the area of Elista. The attempt to hold this overstretched front for a long time was the first mistake that put the 6th Army in a critical situation at the end of November 1942. The second, even more serious mistake was that Hitler forced Army Group B to use its main striking force, the 6th Army and the 4th Panzer Army, in the battles in the Stalingrad area and in Stalingrad itself. Ensuring the deep northern flank of this group in the area of the Don River was assigned to 3 Romanian, 1 Italian and 1 Hungarian armies, as well as in the area of Voronezh. The weak 2 German army. Hitler must have known that the Allied armies would not be able to resist a serious Soviet offensive, even covered by the defense along the Don. The above also applies to the 4th Romanian Army, to which he entrusted the provision of the right open flank of the 4th Panzer Army. After the first onslaught managed to seize only part of the city, the attempt to seize Stalingrad through a systematic offensive to ensure dominance over the Volga was for a certain short period of time apparently was permissible. But leaving the main forces of Army Group B in the Stalingrad area for many weeks with insufficiently secured flanks was a crucial mistake. Thus, we literally put the initiative in the hands of the enemy, deprived of it on the entire southern wing, in view of the fact that we are bogged down in the fighting for Stalingrad. The enemy was literally invited to take advantage of the opportunity to encircle the 6th Army. To this was added a third error, the amazing organization of troop control on the southern wing of the eastern front of the German army. Army Group did not have its own commander. It was commanded part-time by Hitler. Army Group B included no more and no less than 7 armies, including 4 Allied. And when it comes to the Allied armies, which make up the majority of the force, such a task is beyond the capabilities of a single Army Group headquarters. So the headquarters of Army Group B correctly chose its location behind the front of the defense on the Don to better observe the actions of the Allied armies, but the choice of this point unwittingly led to the fact that the headquarters was at too great a distance from the right flank of the front. To this was added to the fact that as a result of Hitler's intervention, the headquarters of the Army Group was largely removed from the leadership of the actions of the 6th Army. In the Oak, these difficulties in command were taken into account, and there was prepared an order for the formation of a new Army Group Don under the command of Marshal Antonescu. But this group headquarters has not yet been put into effect, because Hitler first wanted to wait for the fall of Stalingrad. That the Romanian Marshal was not then involved in the leadership of the operation was a major mistake. Of course, his operational abilities have not yet been tested, but at any rate, he was a good soldier. His personality would have helped to strengthen the will to resist in the Romanian commanders, who feared him as much as the Russians. Antonescu's presence would have given greater weight to demands for new forces to supply the flanks of the Stalingrad front. He was, after all, the head of state and an ally with whom Hitler would have to reckon more than with the commander of the 6th Army or Army Group. As is clear from the letter that sent me Marshal Antonescu after I took command of Army Group Don, he was severely worried about the situation, repeatedly pointed out the threatening situation, especially 3 Romanian army. But as long as he was not responsible, the leader at the front, these instructions could not have the weight they would have had if they came from the head of state, who as commander would be responsible for the threatened area. Certainly, both the headquarters of Army Group B and the headquarters of the Sixth Army made on their part warnings regarding the preparation of a major offensive of the enemy on the flanks covering the front on both sides of Stalingrad. Finally, it should be pointed out another fact that had severe consequences for the Sixth Army, as well as for the entire southern wing of the Eastern Front, the entire Army Group A, as well as the 4th Panzer Army, the Sixth Army, the Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies and the Italian Army relied on a single path across the Dnieper River, the railroad bridge in Dnipropetrovsk. The railroad bridge at Zaporozhye, the highway leading across Ukraine to the Crimea and from there across the Kerch Strait, was partly unrecovered and partly not yet completed by construction. There was also a lack of communications in the rear along the front. Therefore, the German High Command, with regard to the speed of troop transport or transfer of forces, was always at a disadvantage compared to the enemy, who had communications, which had better capacity in all directions. It seems that every commander, if he wants to succeed, has to take risks. But the risk taken by the German High Command in the late fall of 1942 should not have been to tie up for a long time the most capable units of Army Group fighting at Stalingrad, and on the Don front for too long to be satisfied with such a weak. In justification, we can only say that the High Command did not count on such a complete failure of the Allied armies, which was discovered later. At any rate, the Romanian formations, which continued to be the best of our allies, fought exactly as could be expected after the experience of the Crimean campaign. Regarding the fighting ability of the Italians, however, any illusion was superfluous. The risk that the German command would have to take, when it became clear that the summer offensive, although it led to the conquest of large areas, but did not entail a decisive defeat of the southern wing of the enemy front, this risk was of a different kind from the one mentioned above. It would have consisted in the fact that the German command, using the operational capabilities of the large Don Bend, would again move in the space between the Caucasus and the Middle Don to maneuver combat operations to prevent the enemy to seize the initiative in their own hands. But such a substitution of one risk for another was alien to Hitler's way of thinking. He did not draw conclusions from the fact that his offensive failed without decisive results, and thus prepared the tragedy of Stalingrad on November 21. By the headquarters of the 11th Army in the Vitebsky area of the Okh. Orders stated that in order to better coordinate the actions of the armies involved in heavy defensive fighting west and south of Stalingrad, the headquarters of the 11th Army, as the headquarters of Army Group Don, should take command of the 4th Panzer Army, the 6th Army, and the 3rd Romanian Army. In the headquarters was transferred to the rear department, already created for the headquarters of Marshal Antonescu. This department was headed by Colonel Fink of the General Staff, an excellent man and an outstanding organizer of the rear service. Later on, he coped with all the difficulties that constantly arose in the field of supply of the Army Group. It is true that the supply of the 6th Army by air was beyond his competence and capabilities. After my recall in April 1944, Colonel Fink was transferred as Chief of Logistics to the commander of the German forces operating in the West, and I am told in a short time improved the organization of supplies there as much as was possible under conditions of absolute enemy air superiority. Involved in a conspiracy against Hitler, he was executed after July 20, 1944. The Oak order to Army Group Don set the task to stop the enemy offensive and regain the positions lost since the beginning of the enemy offensive. As reinforcements, we could count at first only on one corps headquarters and one division, which were to arrive in Milerovo, that is, in the area located behind the right flank of the later emerged here front of Army Group. From the wording of our task, as well as from the insignificance of the forces that were supposed to be allocated to our disposal, we can conclude that when the order was issued to the OK was not yet clear all the danger of the situation in the Stalingrad area, although that day the ring around the 6th Army had already closed. Back in Vitebsk, and then during one of the stops of our train, which allowed me to talk to Field Marshal von Kleauge and his Chief of Staff, General Wheeler, we received new information. According to this information, the enemy has broken through the front of the 3rd Romanian Army on the Don north of Stalingrad with very considerable forces. The same happened south of Stalingrad in the area of the 4th Romanian Army, which was subordinate to the 4th Panzer Army. Therefore, even from Vitebsk, I sent a telegram to the Chief of the General Staff, in which I noted that at Stalingrad for us may be necessary not only to restore the former front line, given the number of forces introduced by the enemy in the battle. I pointed out that to restore the situation would require a considerable force of the order of one army, which should begin the offensive, if possible, only at the end of the concentration. General Zietzler agreed with me, and promised for the time being to give new forces in the amount of 1 tank and 2 or 3 infantry divisions. I also sent a telegram to the headquarters of Army Group B, in which I asked to instruct the 6th Army to decisively remove forces from their defences to ensure their rear in the area of the crossing of the Don near Kalach. Whether such an instruction was given to the 6th Army, I could no longer establish. Only after arriving on November 24 at the headquarters of Army Group in Starobelsk and talking with the group commander, Colonel General Baron von Weich, as well as with his Chief of Staff, General von Zodenstern, we got a clear picture of the events of the last few days and the present situation. Early in the morning of November 19, after an exceptionally strong artillery preparation, the enemy from its Don bridgehead near Kremenskaya and from the area west of it went on the offensive on the left flank of the 6th Army, as well as the 3rd Romanian Army. At the same time, the enemy with large forces went on the offensive south of Stalingrad against the 4th Tank Army of Colonel General Gotha, holding the front together with the 4th Romanian Army. While the left flank of the 6th Army held firm, the enemy managed to break through in both sections occupied by the Romanians in full depth. Immediately in both areas in the places of the breakthrough were introduced large Soviet tank formations. Already on the morning of November 21, they met on the Don near the town of Kalach, where they got into their hands an undestroyed bridge, which was of great importance for the supply of the 6th Army. Thus, from the morning of November 21 closed the ring around the 6th Army, and the German and Romanian units of the 4th Panzer Army pushed into the cauldron from the area south of Stalingrad. In the cauldron were 5 German corps of 19 divisions, 2 Romanian divisions, most of the German artillery of the RGK, and very large forces of engineering units of the RGK. The headquarters of Army Group never managed to later obtain accurate data regarding the number of German soldiers surrounded in the cauldron. The data provided by the 6th Army fluctuated between 200,000 and 270,000 people, and it should be taken into account that the information on the number of soldiers on the allowance included, along with the Romanian troops, also many thousands of volunteers and prisoners of war. The figure of more than 300,000, which is usually mentioned, is undoubtedly an exaggeration. Part of the rear services of the army was outside the cauldron, as well as part of the transports, the wounded, and these remnants subsequently formed the backbone in most of the newly formed divisions of the 6th Army. In each division they amounted to at least 3,000 men. If we take into account that the divisions of the 6th Army by November had already suffered casualties in manpower, the figure of 220,000 men of the encircled troops, including numerous artillery and engineering units of the RGK, will obviously be quite accurate. Of the compounds not consumed in the battles, the 4th Tank Army had 16 motorized infantry division, which occupied the defence on the extremely stretched southern flank of the army in the area north and south of Ilista, and 18 Romanian division on its northern flank. All other Romanians were partly pushed back to Stalingrad, partly annihilated, partly disappeared. Army headquarters attempted by hastily assembled remnants of Romanian units, German rear services, etc., to hold a line of guard in front of Kotelnikov. It had not yet been attacked. The remnants of the 4th Romanian Army were subordinated to Colonel General Gotha of his army, which occupied the defence south of Stalingrad. After the defeat of the Romanians withdrew to a new line south and southwest of Stalingrad, becoming a front to the south, and was subordinated to the headquarters of the 6th Army. The 6th Army, consisting of 4, 8, 11 and 51, AK and 14 TK, was surrounded in the Stalingrad area. The 11th Army and parts of the 8th Corps, adjoining it from the east, were withdrawn from the line on both sides of the Don to the formed western front of the cauldron, with the most prominent point in the area east of the bridge near the town of Kalach. A new southern front was formed from the reserves and parts of the 4th Panzer Army and 4th Romanian Army that had been pushed back to Stalingrad. The cauldron was about 50 km in diameter from east to west, and about 40 km in diameter from north to south. The front of the 3rd Romanian Army found itself broken through on both flanks. In the centre, courageous resistance was provided by a group of about 3 divisions under the command of General Laskar, who had already distinguished himself in the battles of Sevastopol. It was surrounded. It was assumed that it had already been taken prisoner. Being in reserve, 48 TK, concentrated on the Don bridgehead, made apparently too late counterattack, which was unsuccessful. Both divisions of the corps were surrounded and were ordered to break through to the west. The corps commander had already been removed on Hitler's orders and taken to the Führer's main headquarters. A military tribunal presided over by the ever-ready Göring sentenced him to death, as Hitler blamed the general for the defeat of the corps. However, Heim was later rehabilitated. Indeed, he had too little strength to accomplish the task assigned to him. The corps consisted of a newly created Romanian Panzer Division, which had no military experience, and a 22 German Panzer Division, whose technical equipment left much to be desired. From the 3 Romanian army remained in fact only about 3 divisions, which were not captured by the offensive and stood on the Don, adjacent to the Italians. According to the headquarters of Army Group B, the 6th Army had ammunition for 2 days of fighting and food supplies for 6 days. Supply by air, when the state of the weather allowed, covered only 1/10 of the Army's needs in ammunition and fuel. 100 Junkers airplanes had been promised. The number was to increase. According to available information, the enemy entered the breakthrough south of Stalingrad up to 24 compounds and turned north against the southern flank of the 6th Army, which he vigorously attacked. Through the breakthrough in the strip of the 3rd Romanian Army, the enemy forces of about 24 compounds rushed to Kalach, in the rear of the 6th Army. At the same time, 23 other compounds were advancing, according to intelligence, in a southern and southwestern direction to Chiu. In addition, the enemy had forces in Stalingrad, which managed to hold out until the end against the attacks of the 6th Army and received reinforcements across the Volga. Further, in front of the northern front of the 6th Army, between the Volga and the Don, still stood superior enemy forces. Finally, there was no doubt that the enemy continuously brought reinforcements by rail, and indeed already on November 28 in the area of combat operations of the new Army Group Don a total of 142 large enemy formations. In my Army Group Don was to include encircled in Stalingrad 3 times superior enemy forces of the 6th Army, consisting of 19 badly battered German divisions and 2 Romanian divisions, without sufficient supplies of ammunition, fuel and food, without regular supply. In addition, not to mention the fact of encirclement, it was deprived of freedom of action, as it received a strict order from Hitler to hold the fortress of Stalingrad. So the group included the remnants of the defeated 4th Panzer Army and both Romanian armies and, finally, 1 German division, which had not yet participated in the fighting, but could not be removed from its line of guard in the steppe, where it was the only cover for the rear of Army Group, and 4 still capable Romanian divisions, undoubtedly inferior to the enemy. True, the subordination of the 6th Army to the Group Don was to some extent a fiction. Until now, the army was actually subordinated directly to the OK. Hitler chained it to Stalingrad when it still had the opportunity to free itself by its own forces. Now it was operationally immobile. Group headquarters could no longer command it, it could only assist her. However, Hitler still continued to directly manage the actions of the 6th Army through a liaison officer of the General Staff, which had its own radio station at the Army headquarters. The supply of the army was also primarily in the hands of Hitler, as he alone had the means to supply it by air. Thus, it would certainly have been correct, if under such circumstances I would have rejected the inclusion of the 6th Army in Army Group Don, which would have left it formally in direct subordination to the OK. I did not do so then, because I hoped with the approach of deblocking forces better than OK to organize direct interaction with the encircled 6th Army. It will be described below why in the decisive days it was not possible to ensure such interaction. Not counting the encircled 6th Army, which therefore could not be freely used, all the rest, which first met with the headquarters of Army Group Dan, were the remnants of the defeated armies. The group was allocated the following new forces. To the 4-tank army from Army Group A headquarters, 57 Tukey with 23 TD, and significant ARC forces, as well as newly replenished 6 TD, which was to arrive from Western Europe. On the left flank of the 3 Romanian Army, 1 Corps headquarters and 4-5 divisions, with the task of advancing from the Upper Chir in the eastern direction in order to unblock Stalingrad. In the headquarters of Army Group B, I was shown a radiogram which sent Hitler, the commander of the 6th Army, General Paulus, He reported that, in his opinion, as well as in the opinion of all his corps commanders, it is absolutely necessary to break through the army in the southwestern direction. True, to get the necessary forces for this required regrouping of army forces and withdrawal of the northern flank in order to reduce it and release the necessary forces. In the headquarters of Army Group believed that even with the immediate consent of Hitler, the breakthrough could not be started before November 28. But Hitler did not give his consent and forbade the withdrawal of troops of the Northern Front to a new line. To enforce his decision, he entrusted the overall command of the Northern Front General von Seydlitz. The headquarters of Army Group Don had neither the time nor the opportunity to find out the events described above in the headquarters of the Sixth Army. Apparently, General Paulus, within the framework of Hitler's order, chained him to Stalingrad, did everything possible to remove forces from the less threatened areas of the front of his army. He succeeded in organizing the defense of his exposed southern flank, using the 4-acre 4-tank army for this purpose. He tried further to secure his rear by moving 14 TTK from the east bank of the Don to the west bank, but the corps ran into superior enemy forces on the left bank. At the same time, the enemy was on the offensive in the rear of the 11th Army, which still held its defensive line west of the Don. Situation led to the fact that later the Army headquarters took both its corps, first to a bridgehead west of the Don River, and then on its eastern bank, to take at least a circular defense between the Volga and the Don. These measures saved the army from the disaster that befell its neighboring armies, but the inevitable consequence was its encirclement. It must be said explicitly that the General Command was obliged to timely issue an order that would have given the Sixth Army freedom of action in order to avoid the threatened encirclement. For the High Command, capable of foreseeing the development of events, it should have been clear from the beginning that the accumulation of all German forces involved in the offensive, in the area of Stalingrad and in Stalingrad itself with poorly protected flanks, was a mortal danger of their encirclement as soon as the enemy broke through the defenses of the adjacent fronts. When the Soviets launched their great offensive across the Don and south of Stalingrad on November 19, the German command had to realize what it was facing. From that moment, it was unacceptable to wait until the defeat of the Romanians became an accomplished fact. Even if the defense of the Romanian armies had not been so quickly broken through, it would still be necessary to use the Sixth Army as a mobile force before it was too late to set out to change the situation that had arisen on the southern flank of Army Group, at least in the evening of November 19. OK should have put before the Sixth Army a new task, providing her freedom of action. Without going into the details of the course of the first days of the Soviet offensive, it should be said that the encirclement of the Sixth Army could be prevented only if it in these first days of the enemy offensive tried to break out of the encirclement across the Don to the west or east of the river to the southwest. The General Command was obliged to give such an order. Of course, and General Paulus on his own initiative should have decided to leave Stalingrad, but he was hardly in a position to take it in time, as would have been possible for the OK, because he could not be, like the Oak, informed about the situation in the neighboring armies, when on November 22 or 23 he made the proposal to break out with the army to the southwest. The opportune moment may already have been lost. Another thing that the appeal with this proposal to Hitler was a psychological error. General Paulus knew Hitler and his views on the conduct of the war in the East in the winter of 1941. Paulus was then head of the First Department in the OK. He knew that Hitler took credit for saving the German army that winter from the disaster that befell Napoleon's army in retreat. He believed that the German army was saved by his order to hold on at all costs. Paulus had to tell himself that after his speech at Sport Palace, Hitler would never agree to abandon the city. The name of this city was linked for the dictator with his military prestige. Thus, the only possible would be withdrawing the army from the area of Stalingrad put Hitler before the accomplished fact, especially since the General Command, as it was reliably known, mysteriously silent for 36 hours. True, it is quite possible that such actions could have cost General Paulus his head. However, it is possible to believe that it was not fear of such an outcome that prevented Paulus from doing of his own free will what he thought was right. Rather, a sense of loyalty to his oath to Hitler prompted him to ask him for permission to withdraw the army from the encirclement, especially since he had radio contact with the Oak. In addition, the general situation was not clear enough to him. The difficulty of deciding to act at their own risk increased also, because the attempt to break through would have meant for the army at that time a greater risk than the organization of a circular defense in the Stalingrad area,